Usually when you're waiting on a medical diagnosis, there's this distinct expectation of precision, you know?
Oh, absolutely. It's very cut and dry.
Right. It feels almost like engineering. Like
Yeah.
you break your arm, the doctor puts the x-ray up on that little light board, and there's that jagged white line.
And they just point right at it and say, well, there it is, broken.
Exactly. It's incredibly binary. Broken or not broken. And honestly, there's a real comfort in that.
We definitely crave things that are visible.
Yeah, things that can be neatly categorized and just, placed into a defined box. But the moment you step into the world of philosophy and theology, that x-ray machine just completely shatters.
It really does. Suddenly you aren't looking at a clean fracture on a film anymore.
No, you're looking at a diagnostic landscape of reality itself, and, well, it's murky. You're trying to understand the invisible air you're currently breathing.
Yeah, it's the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters, because you're no longer asking what's happening inside reality, right? You're asking what reality itself actually is.
Which is a massive question. So, welcome in, everyone. If you're prepping for a heavy theology exam or trying to wrap your mind around the history of Western philosophy, or, you're just insanely curious about how human beings process the world around them, you have definitely pulled up a chair at the right table today.
It's going to be quite the journey.
Oh, yeah. Okay, let's unpack this. We have a massive stack of lecture transcripts sitting between us today, and I mean like a towering stack.
It's a lot of material.
It is. And these documents, they trace the entire history of philosophy and its spectacular, often really messy collision with Christian theology. The academic term for this specific subject is nature apologetics.
Yeah, and it's this vast, sweeping narrative. The lecturer in these sources is attempting something just incredibly ambitious here.
Right, because we're going all the way back, right?
Exactly. We're going on a journey from the ancient Greeks, navigating through the early church fathers, pushing through all those medieval scholars, surviving the Enlightenment thinkers, and landing right smack in the middle of modern 20th century theology.
It's a marathon. But before we take a single step on that timeline, we have to lay down the framework. Because if we don't, literally nothing in these notes will make sense.
No, it would just be noise.
Right. So the source material we're pulling from today comes from a very specific, fiercely reformed theological perspective. The lecturer has a core premise, like a specific lens through which he is viewing all of human history.
And he frames absolutely everything as a relentless battle between two fundamental worldviews.
Which he calls the one-circle view and the two-circle view.
Yeah, and that distinction is the skeleton key to this entire deep dive. So let's start with the two-circle view. This represents the Orthodox Christian perspective.
Okay, so if I'm visualizing this, I'm picturing two entirely separate circles drawn on a chalkboard.
Perfect visualization. The large circle represents God, so the creator, an eternal, self-sufficient, unchangeable being. And then the smaller circle sitting below it represents absolutely everything else.
So man, nature, the cosmos, time, space, just the entire created order.
Exactly. So the defining feature of this two-circle view is that the circles do not overlap. The creator is not the creature.
Right. The smaller circle is 100% dependent on the larger circle for its existence, but they are not made of the same stuff.
Yeah, that is the crucial boundary line. But then you have the opposing framework, which is the one-circle view.
And this is the idea that God, mankind, and nature are all essentially participating in the exact same reality, right?
Yes. There's only one single circle drawn on the board. In this view, humans might be lower on a scale, and the divine might be at the absolute top of that scale, but we're all made of the exact same underlying substance.
We're just different variations of the same stuff. Now, I want to jump in here and set some ground rules for you listening right now.
Yeah.
It is vital to understand that our source material features heavy, uncompromising critiques of almost everyone who doesn't hold strictly to that two-circle creator-creature distinction.
Oh, he goes after everyone.
He really does. The lecturer critiques Greek philosophers, Roman Catholics, Arminians, Enlightenment thinkers, modern theologians, and he does it with equal passion across the board.
So our job today is to explore those passionate arguments impartially. We're simply mapping out the fascinating intellectual landscape that this source provides.
Right. We aren't here to endorse a particular theological side or tell you who's right. We're just here to understand the mechanics of the argument he's making.
And the reason this matters, the reason this is actually worth your time is that this isn't just about ancient history. It is a masterclass in how hidden assumptions about reality shape literally everything we think we know.
It's about the invisible architecture of your own mind. And to understand the architecture of the modern mind, the source insists that we have to go back to the original architects.
We have to go back to the ancient Greeks.
Right, because the Greeks essentially wrote the default operating system for human philosophy.
They really did. And the lecture argues that Greek philosophy was built entirely inside that one circle trap. He starts this timeline with a figure named Thales of Miletus.
Ah, yes. The water guy.
The water guy. If you open any standard history of philosophy textbook, Thales is almost always listed as the very first Western philosopher.
And his foundational famous claim was just a simple three-word sentence, right? All is water.
Yep. All is water.
I have to admit, reading through the transcripts, I actually chuckled at this part because the lecturer makes a joke about it. He points out that he's recording the lecture on a really rainy day in Mississippi.
Right, I remember that.
And he says, when it rains for a week straight in Mississippi, Thales starts to sound pretty reasonable. It really feels like all is water.
It's a great observation.
But obviously we aren't spending time on Thales just to talk about meteorology. What is the actual philosophical weight of a guy who thought the universe was just a giant puddle?
Well, the physical properties of water are actually irrelevant here. What the source hones in on is the underlying logic, what he calls a colossal monistic assumption.
Monistic meaning just one single thing.
Exactly. When Thales looks at the complexity of the universe and declares all is water, he is essentially declaring all is one. He's stating that every single thing in existence, from the rocks on the ground to human consciousness to the divine itself, is made of the exact same underlying substance.
So before the philosophical debate of human history even officially begins, Thales has already drawn a single circle on the board.
He wiped out the creator-creature distinction from day one. Man and God are in the same circle.
Wow.
And the source views this as a fundamentally apostate autonomous starting point. Notice what Thales didn't do. He didn't consult a divine revelation.
Right, he didn't assume his mind was a finite created thing trying to understand an infinite creator.
No, Thales looked at nature and decided for himself, assuming his human intellect was fully capable of legislating reality from the bottom up.
That brings it right into the modern era for me. Because if you assume everything is just one substance, whether that substance is water, or, if you fast forward to modern scientific materialism, where the substance is just atoms and quarks and brain chemicals, the trap is the exact same.
Structure hasn't changed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If I am just a complex arrangement of the same atoms that make up a rock, then my thoughts, my morals, and my sense of meaning don't really have any transcendent value. I'm just matter reacting to matter. It's the ultimate one-circle assumption.
That is the direct consequence of the monistic assumption. And once the Greeks committed to that single circle, they immediately ran into a massive philosophical traffic jam regarding the concept of change.
Oh, right, the deadlock.
Yeah. This brings us to two heavyweights, Parmenides and Heraclitus. They represent the two great blind alleys of Greek thought.
Let me see if I can map out this tension, because the notes describe it as a total deadlock.
Yeah.
So Parmenides looks at the universe and declares that all reality is one. It's eternal, and it is entirely static.
Right, completely frozen.
According to him, nothing ever actually changes. Motion and change are just illusions. And he argues this to satisfy the intellect, because if you are a strict rationalist, for something to be perfectly true and knowable, it have to hold still.
Truth can't be one thing on a Tuesday and something else on a Friday.
Exactly. But then Heraclitus arrives with the exact opposite conclusion. He claims that everything is in a state of constant chaotic flux.
He has that famous saying, right?
Yeah, that you cannot step into the same river twice. Because by the second step, new waters have flowed in, and you yourself have changed. And Heraclitus makes this claim to satisfy human experience. Our eyes, our senses, they tell us that everything is constantly decaying and growing and shifting.
It feels like Parmenides wanted to freeze the entire ocean solid so he could measure it with a ruler.
While Heraclitus was out there trying to nail down a single crashing wave.
That's a perfect analogy. Both men are desperately trying to explain the whole ocean, but their methods are completely incompatible. You can't have a universe that is simultaneously frozen, solid, and constantly boiling.
Right. And the Greeks recognized this paralysis. They were stuck between pure logic that denied experience and pure experience that denied lasting logic.
Which fueled a huge wave of deep skepticism, at least until Plato arrived on the scene to attempt a grand rescue mission.
And Plato tries to solve this Parmenides-Heraclitus problem by basically splitting reality into two distinct tiers, doesn't he?
He does. He creates the world of ideas and the world of sense.
Okay, so if I'm following his logic, Plato builds the higher tier, the world of ideas, as this eternal static realm of perfect concepts.
Yes, and that upper floor satisfies Parmenides because it's frozen and logically perfect.
Okay, and then Plato creates the lower tier, the world of sense, which is the physical world we actually live in. This lower floor is messy and physical and constantly changing, which satisfies Heraclitus.
He essentially says to them, you are both right, you are just talking about different zip codes of reality.
It's a brilliant philosophical compromise, honestly. And this dualism leads directly to one of the most famous allegories in Western thought, which is Plato's cave.
But our source zeroes in on a very specific, easily overlooked detail about how Plato views the human condition inside that cave.
Right, and it reveals a massive chasm between the Greek worldview and the Christian worldview regarding the nature of evil. So in the allegory, humans are chained in the dark, facing a blank wall, watching shadows dance from a fire behind them.
And they think those shadows are the totality of reality because it's all they have ever seen.
But the lecturer asks a brilliant question here. Why are they in the dark to begin with? According to Plato, their confinement isn't a moral failure. It is just metaphysical bad luck.
Yeah, the source uses a really striking analogy here. Imagine a colony of blind bats living deep in a cave.
Yeah.
You don't look at a blind bat and say, you miserable, rebellious sinner, you are morally depraved.
No, you just say, well, it's a bat.
Exactly. The bat is just out of luck. Its blindness is a condition of its physical nature, not a moral rebellion.
That is a profound shift. For Plato, the physical body itself and the entire changing world of sense are inherently lesser. They are almost evil just by virtue of not being the eternal world of ideas.
Yeah, humans in their pure intellect are viewed as literal sparks of the divine that have somehow tragically fallen or become trapped in this messy, lower realm of physical matter.
So sin or evil isn't a willful moral rebellion against a holy creator. It is simply an intellectual ignorance caused by the misfortune of being glued to a physical body.
And that changes the entire definition of salvation. If the problem is just physical entrapment and intellectual ignorance, then salvation is achieved through philosophical education.
Basically escaping the cave and returning your intellect to the divine realm.
Exactly.
Wait, hold on a second, though. If my intellect is literally a spark of the divine, like if I am made of the exact same eternal stuff as the ultimate reality, what actually happens when I die? Well, do I get to float around in the world of ideas as some enlightened version of myself?
That is the tragic catch of Platonism, according to the lecturer. The source uses the analogy of ice chips to explain this concept of immortality.
Ice chips.
Yeah, imagine the eternal divine reality is a massive, boundless ocean of water. You, existing right now as an individual person with a name and a personality, are a little ship of ice floating in that ocean.
Okay, I'm with you.
You only exist as an individual because you are currently frozen. You are temporarily separated from the whole by your physical form.
Oh, man. That is a really bleak image.
Yeah.
So when the physical body dies, the ice chip just...
The ice chip melts back into the ocean. Immortality in the Greek one-circle system means losing your individual identity entirely.
Wow.
Yeah, to reach the absolute highest state of being, you must cease being you. You just dissolve back into the anonymous, divine blob of the universe.
It's immortality by evaporation.
Yeah.
You live forever, but you are entirely erased. I can see why Plato's own student, Aristotle, looked at this towering abstract system and decided it was fundamentally broken.
Aristotle spent 2 decades studying under Plato, but he eventually pulled in the exact opposite direction.
Right, pointing to an invisible, unreachable, frozen world of perfect forms doesn't actually help a human being understand the physical dirt they are standing on.
No. So instead of starting high up in the heavens with abstract, static ideas, Aristotle decides to start right here on the ground, with the individual, physical object. He builds an empirical staircase.
The source outlines Aristotle's theory of the 4 causes here, and the lecturer uses a fantastic analogy to make this accessible. Because of his own Dutch heritage, he uses the wooden shoe analogy.
It's a great illustration.
I really want to walk through this because it brilliantly grounds a very dense philosophical concept.
Please do. Because Aristotle argued that everything in reality is moving from pure potentiality to pure actuality through these 4 specific causes. So how does the shoe explain it?
Okay, picture a dusty 17th century Dutch workshop. First, you have a raw block of willow wood sitting on a workbench. That wood is the material cause. It holds the raw potential to be something, but it isn't a shoe yet.
Right, it's just matter.
Exactly. Second, you have the artisan. He picks up his carving tools and starts violently hacking away at the wood, exerting physical energy and motion. That action is the efficient cause.
Okay, so the maker's action.
Yes. Third, as he is carving, he isn't just swinging blindly. He has a distinct pattern, like a blueprint in his mind of what a traditional wooden shoe is actually supposed to look like. That blueprint is the formal cause.
The idea or the form.
Exactly. And finally, the entire reason the wood is being carved in the first place, like the reason the shop is even open, is so that a little Dutch boy can have footwear to walk to the Christian school in the morning. That ultimate purpose is the final cause.
It is an incredibly systematic, robust way of dissecting reality. Every single thing possesses matter, motion, form, and purpose. It feels very grounded.
It does. It feels practical. It even sounds vaguely religious when you start talking about built-in purpose and form. So why does the source critique Aristotle so relentlessly?
Well, the critique is that despite flipping the starting point from the abstract to the empirical, Aristotle is still hopelessly locked inside the one-circle trap.
How so?
Aristotle relies on the concept of eternal matter and an eternal impersonal motion, which is a concept he referred to as the unmoved mover or thought thinking itself.
Meaning Aristotle's universe has just always been here, churning away. There's no starting point.
Yes. He absolutely excludes the possibility of a personal creator god who speaks the world into existence out of nothing.
So no creatio ex nihilo.
None. Because matter is eternal, man remains the autonomous starting point, using his own intellect to define a universe that was never actually created.
Okay, so the ancient Greeks spent centuries building this massive, awe-inspiring intellectual fortress. But the foundation of that fortress is entirely a one-circle assumption.
God, man, and nature are all trapped in the same uncreated bubble.
And this reality sets the stage for a massive historical collision. We are moving from the Greek foundation to the early church collision, the metaphorical meeting of Athens and Jerusalem.
Because if the Greeks built a closed, one-circle world, an explosion was completely inevitable the moment early Christians arrived on the scene.
Because the Christians held a fierce, uncompromising two-circle worldview, and they began spreading their message right in the middle of Greek territory.
The tension must have been immediate. You have these early Christian apologists, brilliant men like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, and they are trying to figure out how to communicate the gospel of a personal, resurrected Jewish carpenter to a Roman culture that is completely saturated in high-minded Greek philosophy.
The strategy many of these early apologists adopted was essentially a search for common ground, right? They looked at the great Greek thinkers like Socrates and Plato and said, look, these men rejected the chaotic pagan gods.
They believed in one ultimate unified reality. They believed in logic, order, and reason.
And the source notes, they claimed the Greeks were following the logos, the universal reason. And the Christians argued, hey, we know who the logos actually is. It's Christ.
So Plato and Socrates were basically pre-Christian Christians.
Right. They were on the right track. They just didn't have the final chapter of the book.
They attempted to graft the Christian theological branch directly onto the existing trunk of the Greek philosophical tree.
Now, I have to push back on the lecturer's critique here. Reading that, it sounds like a brilliant, empathetic debate tactic.
It does sound smart.
Yeah. You find common ground with your audience, you validate their intelligence and their search for truth, and then you say, I have the completion of what your philosophers have been searching for. Why does the source view this as such a catastrophic error?
It's a really fair question, and it gets to the very heart of the lecture's view on apologetics. The source argues that this was a fatal error because you cannot simply graft the personal triune Christian God onto the Greek concept of the anonymous holy other. They are mutually exclusive, contradictory concepts at their very core.
Because the Greek concept of the divine doesn't create the world out of nothing. It doesn't judge human moral rebellion. And it certainly doesn't become flesh and die on a cross to redeem a fallen creation.
Exactly that. By conceding that the Greek philosophers were basically correct in their foundational assumptions, Justin Martyr and Irenaeus failed to challenge the core poisonous root of the Greek system.
That's just human autonomy.
Right. They accepted the one-circle premise and essentially just tried to paint a Christian cross on it. The lecturer's argument is that you cannot use a philosophical system built on human pride and autonomous reason to prove a religion that demands absolute submission to divine revelation.
The tools simply cannot build that house.
You can't use a ruler meant to measure a static, eternal universe to measure a God who breaks into history.
That makes total sense. But the source introduces an early hero who finally recognizes this trap and aggressively pushes back against the compromise. a theologian named Tertullian.
Tertullian is a highly compelling figure in this narrative. He saw the danger of the Greek synthesis with absolute clarity. He famously coined the phrase, "What hath Jerusalem to do with Athens?"
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's a great line. He's basically looking at his fellow Christians and saying, stop trying to mix oil and water. Stop trying to force our theology into their categories.
Tertullian insisted that Christians must start from their own unique foundation, which he called the rule of faith. He recognized that you cannot borrow Aristotle's logic or Plato's forms to explain the Christian God.
Because if you do, you end up distorting God.
Exactly. In fact, Tertullian is the thinker who really developed the doctrine and the specific terminology of the Trinity. He fiercely pushed back against the abstract Greek idea of a universal, nameless, detached God,
Insisting on the specific, historically revealed, triune God found in Scripture. So Tertullian is drawing a hard line in the sand. He is reinforcing the two-circle view and telling the Greeks they need to completely abandon their framework.
He was, although the source adds a vital caveat here. The lecture points out that even Tertullian, as brilliant and combative as he was, wasn't perfectly immune.
How so?
Well, when Tertullian wrote about the specific nature of the human soul, he still slipped back into some lingering Platonic ideas.
Oh, wow.
It is a testament to just how incredibly pervasive and sticky Greek philosophy was. It wasn't just an academic theory, it was the intellectual air everyone in the ancient world breathed.
And if Tertullian was trying to hold the line, the transcripts show that others completely surrendered the territory. The lecturer briefly profiles the scholars in Alexandria, specifically Clement and Origen.
And he claims they essentially surrendered to the Greek scale of being. Origen's approach provides a perfect example of what happens when you fully synthesize the two views.
What did he do?
Origen attempted to map the Christian concept of the Trinity onto the Platonic hierarchy of reality. And this attempt led directly to a heresy known as subordinationism.
Let's unpack how that mapping actually works. If I'm trying to force the Trinity onto Plato's scale, I'm assuming that reality has a top, middle, and bottom.
Yes. So Origen places the Father at the absolute top of the scale of being. He is the ultimate, untouchable reality. Then, slightly lower down on the scale, you have the Son. And further down still, you have the Holy Spirit.
Which completely ruins it. And the source points out that this inherently degrades the orthodox view of the Trinity, where all three persons are co-equal and co-eternal. By forcing God onto a one-circle sliding scale, Origen fractures the nature of God.
It degrades the theology to fit the philosophy. You have this massive intellectual tug-of-war happening for centuries across the Roman Empire. The Greek demand for autonomous reason pulling against the biblical demand for submissive revelation.
And all of this tension, this centuries-long war of ideas, eventually reaches a boiling point inside the mind of one single human being. This brings us to St. Augustine.
The source frames Augustine as the ultimate battleground for these worldviews.
Augustine's intellectual and spiritual journey is monumental because it perfectly embodies the clash of the one-circle and two-circle paradigms. He lived the conflict before he wrote about it.
The source outlines his background, and it was chaotic. Augustine didn't start out as a pillar of Christian orthodoxy. He spent his early years deep in the weeds of Manichaean dualism.
And if I understand the notes, Manichaean dualism is this intensely pessimistic worldview where the universe is locked in an eternal war between a good god of light and an evil god of darkness.
Right, matter is inherently evil, and spirit is inherently good.
And we should consider why that was so appealing to a young Augustine. Augustine was famously struggling with his own severe moral failings, particularly regarding lust.
And Manichaean dualism offered a very convenient philosophical loophole.
Yes. If the physical body is created by the evil god, then your physical sins aren't really your fault. The bad god made your body do it. Your pure spirit is just trapped in an evil meat suit.
Wow, that is incredibly convenient. It wasn't me, it was the darkness.
Exactly. But eventually, he realizes that system is logically bankrupt, and he moves on to Neoplatonism, which the notes describe as basically Plato on steroids.
It's a highly spiritualized version of Plato's forms.
But Augustine is still miserable. He is intellectually brilliant, but spiritually agonizing. And then he has that famous moment in the garden in Milan, the Thales moment.
He hears a child singing a song that says, "Take up and read."
Yeah, he opens a scroll to the Book of Romans, and his entire paradigm shatters. He converts to Christianity.
However, the source is careful to note that the intellectual shift inside Augustine's mind wasn't instantaneous. The lecturer uses a very striking, almost grotesque analogy to describe Augustine's internal state during his early years as a Christian thinker.
Yes, the Chang and Eng analogy. Chang and Eng were the famous 19th century conjoined twins whose condition gave rise to the term Siamese twins. The lecturer uses them to visualize the agonizing internal battle inside Augustine's brain.
You have Chang representing the deeply ingrained philosophy of Neoplatonism, and you have Eng representing his new, budding Christian theology.
They are literally stitched together in Augustine's mind. They share the same intellectual bloodstream, but they have entirely different wills, different desires, and fundamentally incompatible natures.
The source argues that one of them ultimately has to die for the other to truly live. And early in his Christian career, Augustine demonstrates a significant flaw that the lecturer highlights.
Right. He tries to prove God's existence by looking entirely inward, relying purely on human reason. Augustine famously wrote a line that sounds beautiful on the surface: "God and the soul I want to know, nothing else."
I read that and thought, what a wonderfly pious thing to say. I don't care about worldly riches. I only want to know God and my own soul. How can the source possibly critique that?
If we connect that statement back to the bigger picture of the Greek trap, we can see the ghost of Plato haunting Augustine's words. By stating that he only wants to know the soul and God, Augustine is subtly dismissing the entire physical created world.
He is dismissing the cosmos. He is dismissing the messy timeline of human history.
And implicitly, he is minimizing the physical, flesh and blood incarnation of Christ. He is falling back on the Greek assumption that the internal human intellect is divine and the external physical world is just a chaotic distraction.
He's still searching for a purely rational, internal proof for God that doesn't require relying on external historical revelation.
I see it now. He is still trying to use the one-circle method of autonomous reason to find a two-circle God. But the source credits Augustine with an ultimate world-shifting triumph in his later writings, specifically in his massive sweeping work, The City of God, and his fiery debates against the Pelagian heresy.
Yes. In those later works, Augustine finally takes the surgical knife and severs the conjoined twin. He fully, unreservedly embraces the two-circle worldview.
And the turning point is his realization regarding the nature of human freedom. The Greeks believed that freedom meant absolute autonomy, the human mind acting as its own ultimate authority.
But Augustine realizes that this autonomous freedom is a devastating illusion, because if you are autonomous, you are just severed from the source of life.
Augustine concludes that true freedom is actually found in complete submission to God, the Creator. He finally accepts that he is living inside the smaller circle.
And he realizes that is the only place where true freedom and joy actually exist. It is a monumental breakthrough. It is the high watermark of early Christian philosophy, according to our source.
So, if Augustine gets it right, and he builds this incredible two-circle theology, how did the church lose the momentum? Why didn't subsequent generations just build on Augustine's foundation?
Because the magnetic pull of the Greek synthesis was simply too strong to resist, particularly as the timeline moves into the Middle Ages. The source points to a massive, tragic step backward, beginning with a mystical thinker known as Dionysius the Areopagite.
Dionysius is the guy who introduced the concept of negative theology to the Western Church. The notes describe this, and honestly, it sounds like an exercise in philosophical subtraction.
That is precisely what negative theology is. The premise is that God is so utterly transcendent, so wholly other and far up the scale of being, that human language is incapable of saying anything positive about what he is.
Therefore, we can only truthfully state what he is not.
Exactly. So you take the concept of a personal God and you just start stripping things away.
You strip away human attributes, you strip away emotions, you strip away physical limitations, you just keep subtracting.
And you keep subtracting until you reach the absolute top of the Platonic scale of being. And according to the source, when you finally arrive at the top and finish your subtraction, what is left? A nameless nothing.
An ineffable, silent, unknowable void.
Yes, which completely destroys the orthodox concept of a personal God who speaks into existence, who acts decisively in human history, and who reveals his specific character in words that humans can actually comprehend.
It turns the vibrant, speaking God of the Bible into a cold, abstract mathematical limit. And this creeping influence of Greek thought sets the stage for the most famous medieval scholar of them all, Thomas Aquinas.
Aquinas is the grand architect of the medieval synthesis. He explicitly utilized the newly rediscovered works of Aristotle to explain and defend Christian theology. This massive project is known as natural theology.
The lecturer's description of Aquinas' project is so visceral. He describes Aquinas as a man trying to build a towering, majestic house.
Right. But instead of using uniform materials.
Yeah, he attempts to build the walls by stacking 500 blocks of Aristotle's philosophy together with 650 blocks of Christian theology.
And from the source's fiercely reformed perspective, this is a disastrous, fundamentally doomed architectural project. It is an artificial splicing of mutually exclusive worldviews.
Think about what Aquinas is trying to mortar together. He is taking Aristotle's concept of an impersonal thought thinking itself, presiding over an eternal, uncreated universe.
And he is stacking it directly on top of the Christian God who actively creates the universe out of nothing and invades history to redeem humans from sin.
The gears don't mesh. The source argues that these blocks will inevitably crush each other because their foundational geometries are completely incompatible. You can't build a stable house when half the bricks are expanding and the other half are shrinking.
The medieval synthesis built a towering, deeply impressive intellectual structure. It held society together for centuries, but it was built over a philosophical fault line. And eventually, the pressure became too much, and the entire block tower collapsed.
Which ushers us into the modern turn. When that massive medieval synthesis shatters, the scholars and thinkers of Europe are terrified. They are left standing in the rubble and they realize they need a brand new absolute starting point.
But instead of looking up to divine revelation to rebuild, they look entirely inward. We have arrived at the Enlightenment.
And the central figure who sets the trajectory for the entire modern world is a Frenchman named René Descartes. He reboots human philosophy with 3 incredibly famous Latin words.
Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am.
Descartes was desperate for absolute, unshakable certainty. He decided the only way to find it was to employ radical doubt.
He decided to doubt the existence of the physical world, to doubt history, to doubt his own senses, until he found a bedrock truth that was logically impossible to doubt.
And he found that bedrock in his own conscious awareness. If I am capable of doubting, then I must be thinking. And if there is thinking happening, there must be an I that exists to do the thinking.
On a purely logical level, that sounds like a rock-solid proof. It's a clever way to defeat total skepticism. Why is the source so incredibly hostile to Descartes?
Well, the hostility is directed at what Descartes implicitly assumes in that moment. By making cogito ergo sum the absolute foundation of all knowledge, Descartes is declaring that man is a self-intelligible, autonomous starting point.
Descartes believes he can fully understand and prove his own existence without making any reference whatsoever to a creator.
He is completely ignoring the creator-creature distinction. The two-circle view is gone. He has placed the human intellect on the ultimate throne of reality.
In Descartes' system, the universe, and eventually even God himself, must step into the courtroom of the human mind and prove their existence to him, the rational man.
Descartes appoints himself the supreme judge, and God is put on trial. That is a staggering shift in posture.
And the source argues that once you make the isolated human mind the absolute starting point, the train goes off the rails with terrifying speed.
The transcripts trace this rapid evolution through the British empiricists, John Locke, George Berkeley, and finally, David Hume.
It is a rapid, steep descent into absolute skepticism. John Locke starts the domino effect by arguing against Descartes' idea that the mind has innate ideas built into it. Locke famously argued that the human mind is a tabula rasa, a blank slate.
According to Locke, every single piece of knowledge we possess comes exclusively through our physical sensory experience.
Which, to a modern ear, sounds perfectly scientific. We learn by observing the world around us. We see, we touch, we learn.
But then David Hume takes Locke's blank slate premise and ruthlessly pushes it to its absolute, devastating logical extreme. Hume is the ultimate uncompromising skeptic.
What does he argue?
He argues that if it is true that all we can ever know are our disconnected sensory perceptions, then we cannot actually prove the existence of causality. This is a mind-bending concept.
Okay, let's break that down.
Hume says, imagine you are watching a game of billiards. You see the white cue ball roll across the felt and strike the red ball. The red ball then rolls away. Your mind assumes that the white ball caused the red ball to move.
Now Hume says no.
Right. You did not see causality. You only saw 2 isolated, independent events happen in quick chronological sequence. You cannot see, touch, or measure the invisible force of cause and effect.
So reality itself becomes completely disjointed. If we can't prove causality, we can't prove anything.
Exactly. The source uses this haunting image to describe Hume's universe. Facts become like beads without holes in them. You can't string them together into a necklace. There is no narrative, no connecting order, no scientific laws, just an endless barrage of isolated, meaningless moments of chaos.
And this leads to an analogy from the transcripts that perfectly captures the destructive power of Hume's skepticism.
The Queen Mary analogy. I absolutely love how the lecturer unpacks this. Imagine David Hume as a passenger sailing across the Atlantic on the grand ocean liner, the Queen Mary. Hume is sitting in his luxurious cabin, and he decides that he strongly dislikes the captain of the ship.
In this analogy, the captain represents God, and the ship represents the ordered Christian universe.
So out of spite, Hume decides to set fire to the little wastebasket in his cabin. He wants to reject the Christian foundation.
But the nature of fire is that it refuses to stay in the wastebasket.
Exactly. The fire spreads, it burns down his cabin, it spreads into the hallway, it ignites the lower decks, and eventually the fire burns down the entire magnificent ship of science, logic, and reality.
By destroying the Christian foundation of an ordered universe governed by a rational creator, Hume accidentally incinerates the very foundation that makes scientific inquiry and human knowledge possible.
Without a God who guarantees the uniformity of nature, you don't have a ship. You just have a shoreless, terrifying ocean of random chance.
It is a brilliant illustration of the source's primary argument. You cannot continually harvest the fruits of an ordered universe if you take an axe to the roots of the Christian worldview.
And as the flames of skepticism were rising, the church attempted to fight back. The source highlights Bishop Joseph Butler, who tried to combat this skepticism by using the skeptics' own empirical weapons against them.
Yes, Bishop Butler wrote a massively influential book called The Analogy of Religion. He attempted to use the new secular empirical method to prove the truth of Christianity.
He gathered mountains of probabilistic evidence, arguing essentially, look at the intricate design of nature, look at the historical probability of these events. If you weigh all the empirical evidence, it is highly probable that God exists and that the Christian narrative is true.
Butler's work marks the birth of modern evidential apologetics.
So let me synthesize this, because this feels like a massive turning point in the source material. Why does the lecturer absolutely hate this evidence-based approach?
Because in a modern context, using evidence to defend your faith is considered the gold standard.
Right. Why does the source view Butler as a tragic failure?
The critique of evidential apologetics is perhaps the most crucial point in this entire deep dive. The lecturer relies on what he calls the iceberg argument. He asserts that you cannot move a massive iceberg if you are standing on the iceberg itself.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that.
Bishop Butler was attempting to prove the existence of the Christian God, a God who is the sovereign, absolute creator of all logic and order. But Butler was trying to build this proof while standing firmly on the philosophical platform of empiricism.
And empiricism, as Hume proved, is ultimately based on random chance and human autonomy.
You cannot use a philosophical system built on chaos and isolated facts to prove a universe ordered by an absolute God.
The lecturer says it is like picking every single apple off a tree, stripping the facts of their divine, created meaning, and then desperately trying to tie them all back onto the dead branches with little pieces of string.
It is artificial. It doesn't hold. You are adopting the one-circle method of autonomous human evaluation to try and prove a two-circle reality.
That is a devastating critique. You can't fight a fire by throwing gasoline on it.
Oh.
So Hume has set the ship of reality completely on fire. Bishop Butler is standing on the burning deck trying to put it out with a probabilistic water pistol.
Science, knowledge, and theology are all on the verge of total catastrophic collapse because of this skepticism.
And that desperate crisis ushers in the arrival of Immanuel Kant and his infamous sausage grinder.
To save the burning ship, Kant steps forward with a radical, unprecedented solution that forever splits human reality straight down the middle.
Immanuel Kant is arguably the most pivotal, unavoidable figure in modern philosophy. He famously wrote that reading David Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber.
Kant realized with horror that Hume was absolutely right. If the human mind is just a blank slate passively receiving random sensory data, then causality is a myth, and science is completely impossible.
So, to rescue science from the ashes, Kant executes what he called a Copernican revolution of the mind.
Before Kant, the universal assumption was that the human mind had to conform to the facts of the outside world. If I wanted to know something true about a tree, my mind had to accurately reflect the reality of that tree out there in the world.
Precisely. The mind was viewed as a mirror. But Kant flipped the entire universe upside down. He argued that the mind does not conform to the facts. The facts conform to the mind.
Which brings us to the greatest, most memorable analogy in this entire stack of transcripts, the sausage grinder.
I want to spend some time here because it makes a ridiculously dense philosophical concept brilliantly clear.
It is the perfect visualization of Kant's epistemology. Walk us through the grinder.
Okay, imagine a pile of raw, completely unformed, visually unidentifiable meat sitting on a butcher's block. That raw meat represents human sensory experience. It is pure chaos.
It is Hume's bees without holes. It is unknowable in its raw state.
Now imagine a heavy iron meat grinder bolted to the table. That grinder represents the human mind. Kant argues that raw, chaotic experience goes into the human mind, and the mind automatically, subconsciously forces that raw data through its own internal, pre-installed gears and molds.
These internal molds are the concepts of space, time, and causality.
The mind grinds the chaos, and what comes out the other end of the machine? Neatly packaged, perfectly uniform sausages.
And those sausages represent the ordered, intelligible, scientific world that we consciously experience every day.
Right, so Kant triumphantly saves science. He says to the skeptics, look, the world is ordered, we can do physics and chemistry, but here is the devastating twist.
What is it?
The world isn't ordered because a sovereign God created it with intrinsic order. It is ordered because the human mind is a sausage grinder that aggressively forces every piece of chaotic data to look ordered. We can never, ever know what the raw meat actually looks like. We are only capable of knowing the sausages we produce.
It is a brilliant, desperate rescue operation to save human knowledge. But the cost of that rescue was astronomical. By claiming we can only know what our minds process, Kant permanently split the universe in two.
He created two distinct sealed realms, the phenomenal and the noumenal.
The source notes use the terms I-it and I-thou to describe this massive split. Let's define the borders of these two new worlds.
The phenomenal realm, the I-it dimension, is the world of the sausages. It is the physical, observable world of space, time, and cause and effect.
This is the exclusive domain of science. And in this phenomenal realm, everything operates by strict, unbreakable, deterministic machine laws.
But humans aren't just deterministic machines. We feel guilt. We make moral choices. We talk about freedom and justice and God. Where does any of that fit if the phenomenal world is just a giant clockwork machine?
That tension is exactly why Kant had to create the noumenal realm, the I-thou dimension. This is the upper realm of things in themselves, the reality of the raw meat before it hits the grinder.
This noumenal realm is the domain of human freedom, of ethics, of the soul, and of religion.
But here is the fatal catch that altered theology forever. Kant declared that theoretical reason, the human sausage grinder, cannot operate in the noumenal realm.
If I'm reading the implications of this correctly, it is devastating. Kant made a safe little room for religion, sure, but he only made room for it as an as-if.
Yes, because Kant says we cannot theoretically know anything outside the phenomenal realm of science, we cannot actually factually know that God exists. We cannot know that the soul is immortal.
However, Kant argues, for practical ethical reasons, simply so that human society doesn't immediately collapse into violent anarchy, we must act as if God exists. We must live our lives as if we possess free will.
Religion is violently demoted from a statement of absolute historical truth to a merely practical necessity for maintaining good morals.
It's the ultimate philosophical demotion. God is no longer the terrifying, awe-inspiring creator of the cosmos. He is reduced to a useful societal fiction to keep people from stealing their neighbor's sheep.
And the source is vehemently, aggressively opposed to Kant's settlement, because Kant's dualism places the autonomous human mind completely in charge of defining reality, while conveniently banishing God to an unknowable, silent upper dimension where he can never actually interfere with human affairs.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the final act of our narrative, the existential and neo-orthodox aftermath. Because Kant essentially dropped a philosophical nuclear bomb on theology.
Once Kant legally declared that God cannot act directly or be known in the physical space-time world of cause and effect, the next century of theologians were trapped.
They had to invent entirely new vocabularies to even talk about faith without violating Kant's rules.
The entire 19th and 20th centuries of theology can be read as a desperate attempt to do Christian theology while wearing Kant's philosophical straitjacket. The source briefly touches on Hegel, who attempted to fix Kant's rigid dualism by introducing the concept of the concrete universal.
If I'm translating Hegel correctly, he essentially looks at Kant's silent God trapped in the noumenal realm and says, no, God isn't stuck up there. God is actually realizing himself through the messy process of human history.
God is a process. He is growing, learning, and evolving alongside human civilization.
Which is, again, a profound, undeniable violation of the orthodox two-circle view. A God who is evolving is not the eternal, unchanging creator of the universe.
But the real climax of the source's historical survey arrives with the towering giants of 20th century theology. Soren Kierkegaard, and most importantly, Karl Barth, the undisputed father of neo-orthodoxy.
Karl Barth is a massive figure in these transcripts. The lecturer spends a huge amount of time dismantling his theology. Barth was a pastor during the crisis of World War I. He was reading the book of Romans, and he experienced a theological earthquake.
He looked at the liberal theology of his day, which basically just made God look like a projection of nice European cultural morals, and he was disgusted.
Barth famously declared that God is wholly other. He said that God speaks senkrecht von oben, straight down from above, shattering our human categories.
And to a vast majority of the Christian world at the time, Karl Barth sounded like a massive, heroic return to orthodox biblical theology. He sounded like John Calvin thundering from the pulpit.
I'm actually going to push back on the notes regarding this. The source freely admits that Barth sounds exactly like Calvin. Barth uses all the heavy, traditional orthodox words: sin, grace, sovereign revelation, the word of God.
So if he is using all the right vocabulary and tearing down liberal theology, why is the lecturer so fiercely, almost relentlessly critical of him?
This is where we have to dig deep into the linguistics of the hidden architecture we've been talking about. The lecturer argues that Karl Barth is performing a theological bait and switch.
He is using all the comforting orthodox words, but he is secretly filling those words with Kantian meaning.
Let me see if I can grasp how that actually works in practice. How do you change the meaning of the word God while still sounding orthodox?
Take the foundational concept of God's existence. In historic two-circle orthodoxy, God exists in and of himself, eternally, regardless of whether he ever decides to create a world or reveal himself to humans. His existence is independent.
But Barth, who is still operating under Kant's unbreakable rule that we cannot know things in themselves, alters this.
Barth says that God is his revelation. God literally has no existence apart from his act of revealing himself to humanity. God's very essence is his relationship to us.
He merges the actor with the action. If God is only the act of revelation, then without humanity to receive the revelation, God essentially vanishes. But the most glaring, concrete example in the source is the critique of Barth's view on the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
The resurrection is the ultimate test case. For historical Orthodox Christianity, the resurrection is a literal event that happened on a specific calendar day in a physical geographical rock tomb outside of Jerusalem.
It happened in the realm of physical science, what Kant would call the phenomenal realm.
But Barth, according to the source, claims the resurrection happened in Geschichte, not in history. Let's unpack those German terms because they are doing a lot of heavy lifting here.
Barth adopts a crucial linguistic distinction. History refers to mundane calendar history. It is the realm of space, time, journalism, and cause and effect. It is the realm of Kant's sausages.
Geschichte, on the other hand, refers to supreme spiritual history. It is the realm of ultimate meaning and existential encounter, what Kant would call the noumenal realm.
Barth argues that you cannot lock God's supreme transcendent miracle into the mundane, observable world of history. Therefore, Barth says the resurrection is absolutely real, but it is real purely in Geschichte.
I use an analogy to understand how bizarre this distinction actually is in practice. Imagine a husband looking his wife dead in the eye and saying, "I love you."
But I want to be clear, I don't mean the word love or the word you in any way that you physically, historically, or emotionally understand them. I mean them in a suprahistorical, purely meaning event kind of way.
It completely empties the event of its factual, lived reality while desperately keeping the emotional vocabulary to make everyone feel better.
That is precisely the source's critique of neo-orthodoxy. By moving the resurrection out of observable calendar history, Barth is bowing the knee to Kant's rule that God cannot directly interfere in the physical world of science.
Barth tries to save the Christian faith by hiding it up in a protected upper dimension where scientific skepticism can't touch it.
But in doing so, the source argues, Barth destroys the actual physical truth of the gospel. He sacrifices the facts to save the feeling.
And the lecturer wraps up this incredible, exhausting historical survey with a theologian named Jürgen Moltmann and his famous theology of hope.
Moltmann recognized the trap Barth was in, so he shifted the focus of theology entirely to the future, to eschatology. He argued that God is the God of the future, constantly pulling humanity forward toward a new reality.
But the source points out the fatal flaw. Moltmann is still hopelessly trapped in the exact same Kantian dualism. He still denies that God intervenes directly in the present historical causal world.
He simply took Kant's unreachable noumenal realm and moved it from above us to ahead of us.
It's just rearranging the furniture in Kant's house. You haven't actually left the building.
The one-circle trap remains closed.
Well, we have finally reached the end of this massive intellectual journey. Let's try to synthesize everything we've just mapped out.
From the ancient water of Thales to the frozen ocean of Parmenides, through the conjoined twins of Augustine's mind, past the philosophical sausage grinder of Immanuel Kant, and all the way to the neo-orthodox vocabulary tricks of Karl Barth.
The source material argues one relentless, uncompromising point. Any philosophical system that assumes man is the autonomous, independent center of the universe, the one-circle view, will inevitably, inescapably destroy the Orthodox Christian two-circle worldview.
It will destroy it even if it dresses up in robes and uses all the right religious vocabulary.
And as we close, we want to connect this vast history directly back to you, the listener. You might not be an academic theologian or a professional philosopher. You might just be trying to navigate your life, your career, and your daily newsfeed.
Why does this dense history matter to you? It matters because it demonstrates vividly and repeatedly that the hidden framework through which you process facts is just as important, if not far more important, than the facts themselves.
If your foundational assumptions about reality are flawed, every single conclusion you build on top of them will be skewed. You cannot simply debate the data. You have to ruthlessly examine the lens you are looking through.
And that leads me to a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you step away from this deep dive. Think about a fierce, intractable debate you recently witnessed or participated in. Maybe it was a political argument, a debate about a scientific policy, or even an argument about what constitutes good art.
As you watch those two sides screaming at each other, were they actually disagreeing about the raw facts on the ground?
Or were they secretly operating with completely different philosophical sausage grinders of reality? Were they standing in different circles without realizing it?
Until you figure out which invisible machine is processing the meat, you will never understand why the sausage looks the way it does.
Thank you so much for pulling up a chair and joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the muddy waters of human thought. We'll see you next time.